Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, good whatever when you're watching me. Um, Today I wanted to spend some time to talk about the Iran-Contra scandal, CIA's involvement in potential drug trafficking within the United States, specifically targeting Black communities. And for that, what I'm going to do is lay the groundwork of Iran-Contra and then later touch on personal beliefs and where the CIA ties into this, right? So back in the day, there was a war. There was a war that a civil war that broke out in Lebanon. And during this war, the PLO as well as Israel, well, the PLO joins this war, which is the Palestinian Liberation Army or Liberation Offensive, whatever. PLO. Imagine some acronym there. And Israel then invades Lebanon to dispel the PLO. Now, at this point, um, U.S. hostages are taken by Iran to discourage Israel from advancing further because the U.S. and Israel are allies. Iran says, "Hey, U.S., we have your guys. You you need to tell." You need to tell Israel to GTFO, otherwise we're gonna have problems, and we're not gonna release this. Um, this huge issue. Let's see. Yep. But that being said, we see continued issues throughout this period of time in the 1980s, where when Ronald Reagan's president of U.S. and foreign civilians being captured by maybe Islamic Jihad or Hezbollah or these different factions that are often Iranian. Why am I saying it like that? Iranian sponsored. I was trying to say Iranian and Iran at the same time. But Iranian sponsored military groups or terrorist groups, which Iran often does. They're known to be like the largest state-sponsored terrorist supporters ever, which is like a big reason why we impose a lot of sanctions and don't let them have nuclear weapons, and because they actively endorse terrorism in certain parts of the world. But that being said, right? It was the stated policy of the Reagan administration not to negotiate with terrorists under any circumstances, which set the administration in a particularly weird position because how can I negotiate with terrorists to get my people back when I'm not allowed to negotiate? Um, a little bit about Reagan. He was Cold War cucked, if you will. Believer in the domino theory, the vast spread of communism, and and grossly anti-communist. He saw that the falling of Cuba, that because socialist rebellion there overthrown the government. He saw that as an issue and right in the US's backyard as Cuba had become a Soviet Union proxy state. And then, so because of that, Reagan signed off on the support of the Contras who opposed the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. The Sandinistas being the leftist faction, um, or communists, and then the Contras that oppose the leftists, um, being the side that we supported. So the CIA was involved in these essentially shadow wars where we supported, we supported democracy. And I think a lot of this was called Project Democracy in countries such as Nicaragua and El Salvador. Um, this was again, fueled by Cold War ideals and propaganda and fear because of the domino theory. We think that once, these our countries on our continent fall, everything will fall as this socialist movement continues to spread. We've, of course, that's not true, but it was a fear at the time. And then on top of that, um, Central America, banana republics, and a lot of business that was conducted in these areas because of trade. There was fear that with socialist revolutions that we may, I don't know, you could argue maybe like the labor market, labor force changes. They don't do business with democratic nations, and we were afraid of losing that. So how do we solve that? We install governments and people like us. But that being said, with this whole Iran-Contra scandal, Congress passed a law strictly prohibiting the fact that we are not to support the Contras, for many reasons, mostly to avoid another situation like Vietnam, where we overextend to support our allies. We kill a bunch of young men, 58,000 that we lost in Vietnam, as well as millions and billions of dollars spent on this war effort, right? So that was one reason. Secondly, Contras were terrorists. They were bona fide bad guys. They engaged in torture. They engaged in guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare doesn't necessarily make you bad, but hey, they engaged in it, all right? Um, and they were largely hyper violent, killed civilians, and trafficked drugs. These guys were not upstanding citizens, but we turned a blind eye to many of those negatives as as the values of democracy was more important to us. We could deal with all that. We could deal with all the bad stuff once democracy got into power. But anyway, yeah. So there was a former Marine named Oliver North who worked at the National Security Agency or the NSA, and he was in charge of conducting this covert shadow war. Um, his role in that was largely finding sources of funding, um, and occasionally borrowing CIA assets. We'll get into that a little bit later. But that being said, he often duped or convinced foreign governments to provide aid to the Contras, in the form of donations. In return, hopefully, these countries felt that or hoped that the U.S. would show favor at some point in the future. This often wasn't the case. An example of this would be $24 million donated by Saudi Arabia, at one point. He even approached private wealthy citizens within the U.S. for donations and funding the shadow war. Again, because Congress regulates the budget and spending and allocation to these departments, and these departments are largely transparent where we can see it, unless operations are covert, which they have to get a, approved explicit funding for. Um, unless they're covert, we see where those dollars go. And if we're missing millions that wasn't previously asked for, we have a problem. So we had to find other funding sources. One of these funding sources, and where it becomes the Iran-Contra scandal, right? All the hostages taken by Iran and its proxies, we couldn't negotiate directly. So what do? We hire Ghorbanifar, an Iranian international arms dealer, okay? And we couldn't sell weapons directly to Iran. So what we did was we sold weapons to Israel, right? We received payments through Israeli accounts, but and through Ghorbanifar, but the money was coming from Iran because excuse me, we were selling Iran, uh, we were selling them missiles and missile parts. 2,000 missiles for the release of two hostages. I forget what year that was in, but I think it was 86, I think. Don't quote me on that. I'm not gonna check either. I'm just whatever. Forget I said a date. But but there were tons of hostages to get released, and it was we could not continue to supply at the level we did. Ghorbanifar was lying because he was reaping large amounts of money from the arms deals. He would often lie to both sides and say Iran's going to release all the hostages for an extra 800 missiles. We would send 800, and then he would say, "Hey, they only sent six," and they would release nobody. And yeah, then he just kept profiting, and he was encouraged to continue to incentivize more and more arms deals because he got to keep playing the middleman. But that being said, there was an instance in 1985, I believe, where a shipment of missiles was supposed to l- leave Israel, okay, go to Lisbon, Portugal, for whatever reason, and then to Tehran. But Lisbon did not let that plane through for whatever reason. At which point, Oliver North, who's again, if you remember that name, in charge of the Contra funding, is also dealing dipping his fingers into this. He says, "Dude, oof, we got to get these planes, otherwise we're not going to get those hostages, which they weren't going to get anyway." But so he calls up this dude that used to work at that works, sorry, at the CIA named Secord, right? Imagine that's straight, and that's an R. Secord. Okay. Now he calls up Secord. Um, and says, "Hey, we need CIA planes. You do arms deals for the Contras all the time. You drop weapons into the jungle. I need you to go deliver these missiles to Iran." And he agrees, but the problem with this is anytime you use other department assets, you need to produce a finding. You need to have a reason for it. And then that reason needs to be approved. However, they didn't do this because all this was off the books. They didn't receive, this was illegal under the Boland Amendment from Congress, and they didn't have explicit funding for it. So they're not going to produce a finding. They didn't make a finding. We're not documenting this. So they did it anyway and created one retroactively that was later torn up, the only copy of it. But that being said, over this process of sending missiles to Iran, receiving payments, money was being deposited in several accounts. And during that, the 1985, where's my brush? 1985 Lisbon issue, right? During that Lisbon debacle, where Secord had to come save the day, as I mentioned, Secord works for the CIA. Imagine this is like just pretty. Imagine it's beautiful. It works for the CIA. Um, During this debacle, North, who again works for the NSA, in charge of the funding for Contras, gives Secord $1 million. Taxpayer money, baby. U.S. money, baby. Give him a big old schmackarooge. Give him the millions for bribes. He gives him all this money to say, hey, I know you gotta like lie to some people. I know you gotta find a way to initiate this illegal plane transfer and use of tools. So he gave him $1 million and said, make it happen. He only used 150,000 of it. Secord did. Secord only used 150,000 of that million, leaving him with 850K left over. 850. That is just terrible. I hate paint. All right, but 850K left over, right? And because of this, can I actually write on here with, I feel like this, yeah, this is way smoother. 850K left over. North was confused because to his knowledge, he gave the dude $1 million. Why is there still 850,000 just sitting around? He assumed that this was like payment from Iran for the weapons, that were delivered or part of it. And so he mistakenly directs $850,000 of US money that was given to the CIA, but just not all used. He mistakes it and sends it to the Contras. This is the first time where we see the diversion of funds from Iranian weapon sales to the Contras and the Shadow War. Um, Partially, this was happening because of funding, this continued, I should say, because funding for the war was kind of running dry over the years. Foreign governments weren't really paying it anymore, and private citizens weren't donating. So at this point, he needed other monetary sources. So Ghorbanifar, the Iranian arms dealer, guess what he's doing? He's charging Iran 600% markup on the American because technically they're buying from Israel, but Israel buys 90% of its weapons from America anyway. So they're really buying American goods. Um, 600% markup on those goods. So Iran was getting suspicious, like, where's all this money going that we're giving you guys? Turns out it's going to the Contras. Um, but yeah, so this links the Iran arms dealing, which is illegal as hell, and the Contras because funds from Iran were going to the Contras. This is Iran Contra scandal, okay? Two separate, then they became linked. That being said, cool, cool, cool. That's about it. Reagan largely claims ignorance to a lot of the actions here. It's worth noting because of sickness, because of shady members of his cabinet. I think that he was largely surrounded by people that lied to him, tricked him, told him half truths in order to push their own narratives and things of that nature. He was very much broad strokes, not operational detail level when it went during his presidency. So I think and he could have, you could argue that he did it for reasonable or what is it? What's the word I'm looking for? Deniability, reasonable deniability or something like that. Plausible deniability was the word I was looking for. You could say he did it for that reason, and that's why he was so broad strokes. But I think it was the demeanor of Reagan consistently throughout his presidency that he was not a decision maker. He largely delegated, and because of that over delegation to other officials, they became the main policymakers or the decision holders, and he just constantly signed whatever, 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 without truly knowing what was going on, or if he was broadly misinformed to push by the narratives that these cabinet members and people were attempting to push. So that being said, that's Iran Contra, hyper summed up, super quick. Um, that's where it comes from. Cool. Oopsies. I wrote on my screen. But that being said, what does this do? Oh, okay. But anyway, sorry, there's buttons. But now, as I mentioned, the Contras, guess what they did? They were terrorists and they dealt in drug trafficking. It is, it was released in 1996 by the San Jose Mercury News. They released a three-part installment, okay, alleging that the CIA, the Nicaraguan Contra Army, colluded together to sell crack cocaine to Americans, specifically Black Americans targeting these communities, to fund this illegal war. Um, this was interesting because Black neighborhoods became known as the crack capital of the world, and it's thought that a lot of these illicit drug sales, the money pumped into these communities through drug sales, largely encouraged increased violence between LA gangs, such as the Crips and the Bloods, um, because now they were able to buy automatic weapons and increased black market sales of various goods. The series that was released detailing all of this was called The Dark Alliance, the story behind the crack explosion and the crack epidemic. There was there were several people involved in this. Um One was Ricky Donnell Ross. Okay. Um Ross's rise in the world was made possible by Oscar Danilo Blandon and Norwin Meneses, two individuals with ties to the FDN, the the Fuerza Democrática Nicaraguasian. I don't know how you say that one. Um, um, but the Contras, essentially to the Contras were the Democratic Party of Nicaragua. Um, these two individuals had ties, and they were the suppliers of Ross. Because Ross was such a prevalent figure and sold so much volume, he was a large moneymaker uh, for these two individuals, Oscar and Norwin, who were associated with the Contras. And I will go on to say Contras funding their war through drugs. We see this as a common theme throughout history. It's super like the Crips and Bloods. Initially, community protective programs formed to provide community assistance outreach, a means of community support and all these things. But with community outreach, sometimes these they turn to illicit means to fund wholesome programs. And then you see organized organizations turn into crime crime organizations. Um so same thing with Crips and Bloods. We also see the funding of the the Taliban, I believe. It's a Afghanistan or Afghani black tar heroin, massive drug sales. A lot of rebel groups find ways to fund, and drugs happens to be a great way to do it. So it's not uncommon. I don't think the Contras are not a novelty in that regard. But that being said, let's see. Yep. Many readers interpreted these articles as true. They believe that the CIA directly contributed and helped sales initially of these members, but later the sentiment shifted towards the idea that the CIA merely lowered lowered their guard, lowered the turned a blind eye to a lot of the crack sales because it was beneficial to the NSA's mission, Oliver North's mission of funding the Contras. Um, let's see, do. So again, like I said, the sentiment was it shifted to that the government didn't do it. The government didn't engage in crack sales. There wasn't CIA agents selling crack, but they allowed it to transpire on their soil to further, to fight the Red Scare and all that good stuff. So let's see. The Contras who purportedly received drug money from Blandon, so that would be Oscar and Norwin, were referred to as the CIA's army. Okay, and this is according to Mercury News. Um, Investigations into Oscar's cocaine operation conducted by the DEA were allegedly dropped without cause or shunted aside for unexplained reasons. This is all alleged in the Mercury News article, not the actual like facts of these cases. But they were inconsistencies that worried the public. Concerning Oscar from being, oh, state prosecutors invoked the Classified Information Procedures Act, the CIPA, to prevent certain testimony concerning Oscar from being presented to a jury in the interest of national security during, if you remember, Ross. So Oscar and Norwin were suppliers to Ross. Okay. Ross gets arrested. These two suppliers cannot testify because the state prosecutors invoked the Classified Information Procedures Act. So the logical assumption there is because the funding of the Contra Army was off the books, it couldn't they whoever this shadow entity couldn't allow that info to go to trial and become public information because not even Congress knew that this was happening. Um, it's worth mentioning, let me see the Washington Post article quoted an NAACP representative as saying, "This does not prove the CIA targeted black communities. It doesn't say that this was ordered by the CIA. Essentially, our trail stopped at the door of the CIA. We never got the intent of the CIA, right?" Many African American leaders were troubled by the news of Mercury News, of that news outlet, um, because the government was arresting many black men at the time, in their role in creating the crisis. So the war on drugs has an unequal impact on Black Americans. And the Contras case illustrates the discrepancy. Nicaraguan goes free. LA dealer faces life. Flawed sentencing is the main reason for the main reason for racial disparity. Um, Other popular news articles at the time in 1993 was a news article that crack smokers got 3 years, coke snorters got 3 months because Contras were trafficking cocaine, and it was later turned into crack um, once it arrived in the United States. The president of the Los Angeles chapter of the NAACP issued the following statement in response to the Alliance series. We believe it's time for the government, the CIA, to come forward and accept responsibility for destroying human lives. However, the Congressional Black Caucus and many leaders in the black community also insisted upon the investigation into the charges raised by Mercury News. Um, it was in 1987, the Congressional Subcommittee on Terrorism, Narcotics, and the International Operations of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations began an investigation focusing on allegations received by the subcommittee chairman concerning illegal gun running and narcotics trafficking associated with Contras. A 2-year investigation produced a 1,166-page report in 1989 analyzing the involvement of Contra groups and the supporters in drug trafficking and the role of the United States government in these activities. Allegations of cocaine trafficking by the Contras arose during the investigation conducted by Special Counsel Lawrence Walsh. However, that inquiry of the Walsh report reported no findings on these allegations, right? Um, Norwin and Oscar were later convicted of drug trafficking. And let's see. It was purported that Oscar and Norwin gave substantial amounts of money from the drug proceeds to the Contras. However, it was only ever noted that they saw a one-time donation of $50,000. Apparently. Um, so let's see. While there are indications in American intelligence files and elsewhere that Mr. Norwin and Mr. Oscar may have indeed provided modest support for the rebels, including perhaps some weapons, there is no evidence that either man was a rebel official or had anything to do with the CIA. Nor is there proof that the relatively small amounts of cocaine they had sometimes claimed to have brokered on behalf of the insurgents had a remotely uh, significant role in the explosion of crack that occurred that same time in the United States. It's worth noting that they find that the Los Angeles Times found that the available evidence, based on the extensive review of court documents and more than 100 interviews in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Washington, and Managua, fails to support any allegations that the CIA approved a plan for the drug ring to raise money for the Contras, um, and or that the CIA turned a blind eye to the drug ring's activities. They found zero evidence of this. The Los Angeles Times did. The Washington Post mentioned the fact that, let's see, the CIA probably reported in a black community. No, it concluded after conducting reviews of the unnamed sources, yes, that the crack epidemic cannot be attributed solely to the small amount of cocaine trafficked um by Ross, Oscar, and Norwood. Because it's let me see. Okay. Um In the first installment of the Los Angeles Times series, there was a section devoted to the discussion of the origins of crack cocaine. It found that crack cocaine existed in Los Angeles long before Ross, Norwin, and Oscar began selling it. In response to the claim that Ross had played a principal role in bringing cocaine to South Central LA, it identified several drug dealers from South Central, who were contemporaries of Ross and were reputed to have sold similar, if not greater, quantities of crack cocaine. So Ross is not an initiator in this sense, and other suppliers that move similar quantities of that weight of that booger sugar, all right, were already present in SoCal. So the initial Mercury News article that alleges these things because of the conspiracies at the time, because of the Senate investigations, because of all the classifications, because of the lies, because of the covert activities, this was largely it was largely conspiracy on the but was eaten up by the public. So certain, other news outlets conduct further investigations, and it's found that there isn't evidence to suggest U.S. government involvement, okay, or negligence, I might add. So, the Los Angeles Times goes on to say that the CIA involvement in such a scheme was improbable, not impossible, but the chief investigator for Senator Kerry's subcommittee investigation, Jack Bloom, was quoted saying that while the CIA did not have agents selling drugs to fund the Contras, the United States government may have opened channels to help drug dealers bring drugs to the United States and protected them from law enforcement. Now, there is no citation made to the authenticity or where this conjecture comes from Jack Bloom. Um, I think because there's so little evidence about this claim, him presenting this as a possibility, he presents it as improbable. Doesn't necessarily like, I don't think this happened, but there's a possibility as we don't have evidence to rule conclusively one way or another. But he leans towards the side of the CIA was not involved um, through negligence or through direct means of inciting a crack epidemic. Um, I equated, when I was taking notes on this, I equated this conjecture to the sun may explode tomorrow. We have evidence that the sun is a dying star and will one day not work so well. That day could potentially be tomorrow. Is it likely? No, but possibility, yes. Um, so yeah, let's see. Mercury News releases an article at some point mentioning the same NAACP representative Webb, who later says that once they called for investigation into these potential crimes, Webb later goes on to say in a future interview that he believes um, that the ring was a that the drug ring was a pivotal force in the crack epidemic in the United States, because crack epidemic was a complex phenomenon that had more than one origin. Our discussion on this issue needs to be clearer. So even people that come out and call for investigation, they're saying that there is just not enough evidence to rule definitively that this is the sole contributor or even a large contributor to the issues that America faced regarding its drug use. Many readers interpreted San Jose Mercury News article uh, asserting they interpreted it uh, that the CIA and other agencies within the U.S. government had intentionally funneled crack cocaine into black communities, either by permitting or endorsing cocaine trafficking by Meneses and Blandon, or Norwin and Oscar. Others interpreted the Dark Alliance series released by Mercury News that the spread of crack cocaine was unintended but proximate um, and just results of actions taken by the United States government to promote the Contra war effort. Um, a lot of the reason so that was a lot of the, what is the media sphere at the time. I talked about the Iran-Contra scandal. In my head, I don't believe that the CIA directly, one, targeted black communities, for one. Substance abuse tends to there are higher rates of substance abuse in poor communities, and it happens to be that people of color and other minorities are typically disproportionately poor. So that could be why we see disproportionate effects in those communities, for one. Crack cocaine versus cocaine. Um, One is a cheaper derivative of cocaine. One is like pure raw, uncut, not stepped on. So who's doing cocaine? Rich white people. Not that people weren't people were, drugs were always present in the United States. Crack epidemic made it largely affordable in mass and all these other things. And this was why it exploded in the black community, as well as poor people also just having a proclivity towards substance abuse more so than affluent people. Um, I say all that to say, with this information, with the investigations from the Washington Post, from the LA Times, I don't see compelling evidence to suggest, and in the U.S. justice system, it is innocent until proven guilty. I don't see sufficient evidence to suggest that the CIA or U.S. government had a hand in promoting crack sales, drug sales of any kind, and much less targeting specific communities with those alleged drug sales. I don't see evidence of it, for one. For two, um, the CIA, the NSA, Reagan's cabinet, and Reagan himself found ways to fund the Contras without using drugs. I think it's reprehensible to it's a scary thought to think that the government would subjugate its own people to fight a war abroad. That's a scary thought. And I would tend not to think that people that fought for, that care about this country enough to endure the challenges associated with the public office, that would they would turn their back on their fellow countrymen like that, for one. For two, um, like I said, they were supplying Iran with plenty of guns. I think upwards of $16 million worth of sale of various missiles, and laundered upwards of 25%, a quarter of the sales, Iranian weapon sales back into the Contras, for one. For two, there were other sources already. As I mentioned, they reached out to foreign governments. They reached out to private benefactors to further their own goals. There was a lot of shady stuff going on in the government. There were a lot of people that were operating outside the bounds of their predefined powers given in the Constitution. It makes sense to take that additional step, that extra leap in logic to say that yes, they were also doing this. A lot of these guys were caught. a lot of emails, a lot of documents, a lot of memorandums were all seized and analyzed and uncovered, and there wasn't compelling evidence to suggest that this is what was happening. There was a scandal already. We already betrayed American people. Executive branch lied to Congress, went behind their back, went behind the president's back, sold U.S. property to terrorists to fund another terrorist group. It's already insane. We don't need to add another level to it without proof. So, while it's an interesting thought experiment, while it's there is a potential and there is groundwork for it to further explain why crack it potentially exploded around this time. I think the LA Times did a great job determining that there was already presence of crack cocaine. There was already things going on, and that not to say that the rise of this war contributed to elevated drug trafficking. That's probably the case. Was it subsidized by the U.S. government? I just don't see it. I don't see it. So that being said, thanks for listening. I think that's the Iran-Contra scandal, and specifically what I really wanted to address. I laid the groundwork for Iran-Contra. What I really wanted to discuss was the presence of the role that the CIA had in drug trafficking, if at all, and I don't think that there's compelling evidence to suggest that. So, if you guys know any other sources, if you have anything, documents for me to look at, I'll be honest, I read over some released CIA stuff last night, but didn't do a ton of deep diving into this matter. I watched, a 2 hour long documentary on Iran-Contra, um, fairly informed, but if they're subject matter experts, if there are people that know more than me, I'm more than open to read other reputable sources that you deem as valid. So let's uh let's continue to educate each other. You guys have a great rest of your day. Adios. Go ahead, shut me down.